Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. We really appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedules to provide your perspective with us as you being the business leaders of the Kansas City region. We're also so thankful to the Greater Kansas City Chamber of Commerce for the opportunity to share today. We're Mike and Lindsay, Chairman and President of Climate Action KC. Mike is Mayor of Roland Park, and I'm a City Council member in Shawnee, Kansas. Climate Action KC is a coalition of 120 elected officials from 10 distinct levels of office, as well as community and business leaders who are all dedicated to implementing climate solutions that save money, improve quality of life, and create healthier and more resilient communities. Climate Action KC is a big tent organization. We're committed to engaging with all stakeholders, and so we have had several educational engagement events over the course of the past year, from our Green Infrastructure Workshop with Black and Veatch, our Chamber event last August with elected leaders and Chamber members, our Climate Summit at Johnson County Community College, in which we convened 750 people together to learn from over 40 speakers. We really appreciate the Chamber's participation in the 2019 Summit, both as a sponsor and Kathy Bennett's facilitation on the Business Case for Sustainability panel. The Kansas City business community and the Chamber of Commerce are critical partners as we create a roadmap to the vision of Kansas City that we want for ourselves and future generations. A future that's sustainable, economically prosperous, and resilient. And with that, I want to turn it over to Mayor Mike Kelly.
Thank you, Lindsay. Thank you to Adam, and thanks to the Chamber members who have taken some time out to be with us today. As Lindsay said, my name is Mike Kelly. I'm the Mayor of Roland Park, Kansas, and a proud member of the Greater Kansas City Chamber of Commerce with my employer, Hush Blackwell. So why are we here today? The title that we gave to this program is called Climate Resilience. It's everyone's business. And I think it's fairly obvious to those here today and to those chamber members that being cognizant of the environment is important to the success of our economy in the Kansas City metropolitan region. So we appreciate the opportunity to talk about that and talk about what we hope to do in partnership with the business community in this Kansas City metropolitan region. I want to take a quick minute to also thank our partners at the Mid-America Regional Council that do such great convening work, bringing together all 192 municipalities and 9 counties in the MARC footprint. They're a fabulous resource, and like the Chamber, play an important part of setting the tone and being leaders within our region. So why is climate resilient good for the business of Kansas City? Well, first of all, it's because people care. And like I said, without knowing everyone who's here today, I can see the numbers continue to tick up, and it shows that this is a topic that is on people's minds. Right now, it's the #2 issue in exit polling from the primaries that have happened thus far in elections, second only to public health, though there's a very important public health component to climate resilience. It's also very important to the millennial generation and to Generation Z. Obviously, I'll carry the flag here for the millennial generation, which now makes up the biggest part of the workforce. In a recent Financial Times article, it said that 70% of millennials believe that climate change is real, that it's man-made, and that it's a serious threat, and that 75% of those millennials said that a company's social and environmental commitments were a consideration in where they chose to work. Further, a survey of 375 global executives stated that 4 out of 5 saw an increase in workplace activism, with climate resilience being a rising topic. For Generation Z, it now accounts for 40% of US consumers. More than half of Generation Z said that knowing that a brand is socially conscious conscious has an influence on what they buy. 76% of parents of Generation Z members said that their kids influence their purchase decisions. So it's a good thing because people care. But it also can improve your business in that there are strategic solutions that you can implement now that have an impact on efficiencies and the bottom line, as well as having an impact on the environment. And finally, it also helps support a thriving and resilient Kansas City metropolitan region. The members of this chamber have such an impact on the direction taken by our leadership, our elected leadership in the region, and rightfully so. This body helps focus the direction and the sentiments of our region. And there's things that the chamber continues to advocate for that are so important to climate resilience. Things like a strong and dependable supply chain, as well as good infrastructure that helps support our robust economy. So we're here today to talk about a partnership that we've created with a group called the Global Covenant of Mayors. And Karen, if you'll go to the next slide, please. The Global Covenant of Mayors is an international organization that started in the United States by Mayor Mike Bloomberg and has combined now with a partnership in the European Union in one of its endeavors called the International Urban Cooperation Initiative, to which they provide technical assistance to cities to help them become more climate resilient and help them plan for a thriving future. Right now, 1 out of every 10 people in the world live in a city that is a member of the Global Covenant. We are currently engaged in a pilot project with 4 other regions throughout the United States: Denver, Chicago, and Washington, D.C., to take a regional approach to that climate action planning. Not just one city, but an entire region, knowing that those big issues that have an impact on our climate are transboundary, like infrastructure, like energy, like food or water. So it only makes sense to take a regional approach to this planning. And we're happy to and appreciate the resources that have been provided thus far by the Global Covenant of Mayors. The Mid-America Regional Council and Climate Action KC have been working diligently through since October of last year on the first phase of that climate action planning process, which was a regional greenhouse emissions inventory, as well as a climate risk and vulnerability assessment. We are excited to share the results of those with you here today. And for that, I'd like to pass it along to the air quality planner at the Mid-America Regional Council, Mr. Doug Norsby. Doug, take it away.
Thank you very much, Mike. And I appreciate everybody who's been able to join us today for the presentation. As Mike said, this is a regional approach. So we've got, we're looking at it as a regional greenhouse gas inventory. I'll talk about that first. And then we'll go into a little bit of the climate risk and vulnerability assessment that we've conducted to see how our region could be affected by climate-driven events. And then finally, Tom will come in toward the end, and Tom Jacobs will come in at the end, talk a little bit about the climate action plan and the work that is ongoing there and how we move this forward. So first of all, the greenhouse gas inventory, it's really created to look at the entire region's carbon footprint. And again, as Mike said, this is kind of a new way of looking at things. We're one of the 4 regions that are kind of tasked with doing this. But we recognize that this, looking at it regionally, we are covering transboundary emissions, and we can identify more precisely in some ways the areas of largest impact where we can have the most the most effect in what we do. So creating that greenhouse gas inventory is the first step in identifying these mitigation targets and the actions that we could use. The region, as shown here, includes both the MARC region with its 9 counties, and we've included Douglas County. They've joined us in this effort. So we're looking at it as a regional community. So within the greenhouse gas inventory, we looked at 3 prime sectors that are considered to be substantial contributors of greenhouse gas emissions. First of all is the stationary energy segment of this, sector of this, which includes the use of energy by residential buildings, commercial and institutional buildings, and the manufacturing buildings. It's not the processes, but it's the buildings themselves. Then we also looked at the transportation component, which is focused on on-road transportation. This is less of a focus on rail and air traffic. It's more about the on-road highway traffic that we see day to day. And then finally, we look at the waste disposal, solid waste through our landfills and the waste disposal of solid waste, as well as the treatment of wastewater. And it's the processes that make it potable and that clean it before we return it back to the environment. So as you can see on the right, the greenhouse gas emissions inventory really showed that there's this large section, about 2/3 of it, that focuses around commercial industrial buildings and manufacturing industrial buildings. So it's that building component that is a large part of our inventory. The other third is on-road transportation, with small but significant contributions coming from wastewater and some of the waste disposal things. So even though we see that there's large chunks of emissions that are associated with buildings, our energy producers, our power producers have been doing an awful lot to reduce the emissions intensity associated with that power generation. So Evergy, the energy electricity producer for the region, has pledged to cut the 2005 emission levels by 80% by 2050. So far, the emission intensity of the electricity grid in both Kansas and Missouri has been reduced by roughly 17%. And in those intervening years, between 2005 and 2018, we've seen carbon dioxide emissions reduced by 40%, sulfur dioxide reduced by 98%, NOx reduced by 87%. So all of those are greenhouse gases. Sulfur dioxide and NOx are actually more impactful than the carbon dioxide. So those are very significant decreases. They've also increased the renewable fuel sources from 0.4 to 25%. So 50 times what we had available in 2005. During this time, they've also retired 2,200 megawatts of fossil fuel generation and brought 3,300 megawatts of wind generation capacity online. And those expansions are continuing. They're still in the works. In addition to the emissions that are being generated per unit of energy, those ratings, we've also seen a lot of commitment to expanding energy efficiency and conservation from both Evergy and through the natural gas supplier Spire. Part of the challenge has been that even as these investments are being made and programs are being promoted and used, the consumption in the MARC region as a whole has still increased by 8%, and electricity consumption has increased by 51%. So we are seeing a lot of good use of programs. We're seeing some really good programs to bring down the emissions associated with power generation. But just because there's so many people and it's increasing, this population shift is creating more emissions that are overall associated. Evergy has produced some energy efficiency programs that have resulted in 1 million megawatt hours between 2005 and 2018. That's annually. So very significant returns. They also have provided opportunities for subscriptions that'll support wind and solar energy, or offer credits on solar installations that are returning power to the grid. The other thing that they've done to kind of help with the transportation side is they've established a network of 1,100 electric vehicle charging stations that can support over 10,000 vehicles. Spire has provided rebates for high efficiency appliance purchases and weatherization assistance programs for low-income families. They also, in addition to the financial assistance, they have resources that homeowners can review and use themselves to do some weatherization of their homes. They've also, these partner together. So our energy producers are partnering together on energy efficiency supports. And Spire has also tackled some of that challenge of loss of product with the associated methane evaporation and that greenhouse gas contribution by replacing 2,500 miles of aging pipeline over the 15 years between 2003 and 2018 at a cost of $1 billion. So we've got a lot of investments going. They are making some substantial improvements and contributions to the system, but we still are seeing some increases in the region. So we look at a business as usual approach. If we look at what the specific parameters like population growth, GDP growth projections, we kind of combine those, we can see where our emissions are going if we stay on the same policy paths that we're taking. So this process allows us to take the 2015 greenhouse gas emissions inventory and try to scale it out to 2050 based on a combination of projected population growth and expected transportation emissions that are going to be created in the region and energy use patterns. So when you look at the graph, it's kind of humbling. The greenhouse gas emissions are still estimated to increase by 28% from 2005 in our base year to 37 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent by 2050 if we don't take any additional action. So those are projections, again, based on current population and expectations of how the population-driven emissions and transportation emissions will change over that period of time. So now we need to look at targets. We kind of know where we're going. We know where we're at. We need to figure out where we're going and how to get there. So to comply with the Paris Climate Agreement, we hope to achieve 3 mitigation targets using 2005 as the base year. And 2 of these are interim targets. So we want to try to get to 27% reduction by 2025, 40% reduction by 2030, and then looking further out, try to get that 80% reduction by 2050. When we look at this on the graph, the kind of dark line at the top shows where we're headed. The blue line shows where we want to try to go. So the region needs to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to 5.7 million metric tons of carbon dioxide by 2050 in order to achieve that reduction below the baseline. So yeah, we're looking at 5.7, and right now we'd be projected to be right around 37.5 million metric tons. So we have some work to do. So overall, greenhouse gas energy findings, inventory findings, we find that major emission sources are on energy related to buildings, primarily in electricity use, with a large third of that overall chunk assigned to transportation. And we still have some important emissions that are generated in the waste sector. So between the last 10 years, between 2005 and 2015, we were able to kind of compare base year with the last kind of full year of record. We've seen that emissions have increased 4% in the region, while the population has increased by 10%. So that means our per capita emissions have declined by 6%. That means, again, per capita emissions have declined by 6%. We've been making progress, but the population growth is offsetting that. So we need to stay with what we've been doing and try to get even more energy around it. Solid waste disposal has been reduced from 2.4 million tons to 1.9 million metric tons. So we're making progress there as well. So with that really concludes the greenhouse gas emissions inventory section. So now I'll go ahead and pass it along to Karen Clausen, our principal planner at MARC and manager of the air quality program, to discuss the climate risk and vulnerability assessment that we've been conducting for the region.
Great. Good afternoon, everybody. It's wonderful to have so many people join us for this, this presentation today. So I'm going to be covering the climate risk and vulnerability assessment that we've been working on as part of the Climate Action Plan. So the climate risk and vulnerability assessment is a key step along the way when developing a climate action plan. And as with the greenhouse gas inventory, it helps inform where climate action should be targeted in order to meet our broader regional resilience goals. Whereas the greenhouse gas emissions inventory is really focused on those mitigation decisions. The CRVA, as we call the climate risk and vulnerability assessment, is more focused on the adaptation side of the plan. So I included a definition here from IPCC of what adaptation is. This is a pretty standard definition, and it's any adjustment in natural or human systems in response to actual or expected climatic stimuli or their effects which moderates harm or exploits beneficial opportunities. It's quite a mouthful, but I think it helps kind of give kind of an idea of what we're after, what the point of the CRVA is. So, and I'll go back really quick. So some of the key parts of the CRVA is really to focus on understanding what climate risks are to the region. We get a sense somewhat of kind of what they are globally, but the point is really to understand how that comes to us and what that means in terms of our natural hazards and what the risk level is associated with our natural hazards that we can expect, and what some of the vulnerabilities we have in our region. As part of this CRVA, we also look at what our regional capacity is to adapt to these climate risks and how we can effectively work towards lessening the severity of the vulnerabilities that we have in our region. So moving kind of on to the first part of that, again, is the climate outlook. And starting at a global level, we just wanted to put some interesting charts in front of you. And I know that many of you are likely familiar with the general trends related to global climate, whether you actively research this topic or you hear about it in the news or social media. But this is kind of a snapshot of global surface temperatures since 1880. So since the pre-industrial era, there's been about a 2-degree increase in global average surface temperature. So that doesn't seem like a lot, it seems small, but it does take a massive amount of heat energy to warm our oceans enough to bring about this increase in temperature. And this extra heat that we're experiencing is driving regional and seasonal temperature extremes. It's reducing snow cover and sea ice. It's intensifying heavy rainfall and changing habitat ranges for plants and animals, expanding some and shrinking others. And you can see here on this chart that 2016 has been the hottest year on record, and 2019 was a close second. So we'll see what happens with 2020. This next chart, again, very similar, but it's looking at all of the years stacked together, and it's highlighting here years that are on record as being the coolest years as well as the warmest years. And you can see that the last few years, 2015 through 2019, all have been at the top of the charts as far as the hottest years. The green line represents 2020, and you can see that we're right on par with 2016 as being one of the hottest years. But we are interested to find out, if what happens with the rest of 2020. Will we see us again with this year being hot? Will we will we end up being in 2020 the hottest year so far? So where are we projected to go as far as temperature change? So this chart here shows projected temperatures within the 21st century through 3 possible emission scenarios. And these aren't scenarios that just came from one model. This is really from kind of a composite of results from a wide range of models that simulate climate around the world. And you can see here, there's several different paths that we could take, and where we are right now is right at that tipping point. Right now is kind of where we need to act. We need to intervene in this, and that will determine which path we ultimately end up following. So the exact amount of warming that will occur in the coming century really depends largely on the energy choices that we make now and in the next few decades. So to talk a little bit about regional climate outlook, we've largely based our climate outlook on a report that came from Climate Look that was developed for Kansas City, and we can kind of extrapolate the findings from that to the whole region. So focusing on precipitation as well as temperature, here's what we're seeing as potential changes to precipitation. So the region is expected to experience an increase in annual average precipitation here, roughly from 1.5 inches by mid-century to over 2 inches by the end of the century. Extreme rainfall amounts are predicted to increase, as well as excessive rainfall days will likely happen due to storm stacking. We'll see a lot more rain in large doses because of these multiple storms, but we also may see an increase in consecutive dry days. And related to temperature, temperature is expected to increase by about 4 degrees by mid-century and 7 degrees by the end of the century. Heat waves are expected to increase in the region, on average increasing by 5 degrees by mid-century. The number of hot days above 105 is projected to increase in frequency as well, from less than 1 per year, which that just sounds very hot thinking about it, just one day, will increase to 5 times per year by mid-century and 21 times per year by the end of the century. Also, the number of cooling degree days, which is a reflection of the demand for energy needed to cool a building, will nearly double. And on the other hand, energy demand for heating will likely decline about 27%. So again, one additional part of the CRVA that is really important is kind of looking at the natural hazards of most concern for the region. We based a lot of our assessment on some work that was being done in tandem with this assessment, which is the 2020 Hazard Mitigation Plan that Mark has been working on. It's an update of our 2015 plan, and it covers the Missouri side of our region. However, because we're a region, we share kind of the same weather, these hazards apply to the whole 10-county area. So what are the hazards that we're focusing on? So we're focusing on flooding, heat, drought, tornadoes, severe thunderstorms, and severe weather. And with climate variability from year to year, we may see flooding being kind of the more severe hazard one year, but then tornadoes the next. But we looked kind of overall using a lot of these studies from the Hazard Mitigation Plan to really understand, okay, if we had to really focus on, just 2 or 3 hazards that pose the greatest risk for our region, what would those be? So we did those by using this risk matrix, which looks at the different hazards, both the probability of that hazard, how likely is it going to happen in any given year, and also looking at the consequence. Consequence being how much impact will this have on our region in terms of loss of life and damage to property, et cetera. And so how did all of those hazards kind of fall? Here they are. So we know that flooding and extreme heat and drought are our biggest hazards of concern here. And of course, drought and extreme heat are tied together to some extent. Within those three, flooding, however, is kind of the one that has the highest probability and the highest consequence, and the one we may focus on more in our plan, mostly because it has short-term ramifications. We're already starting to see, and have for several years, frankly, the impacts of flooding in our region. And I'll also mention that severe thunderstorms, tornadoes, and winter weather, they're also at least moderate as far as a risk in our region. So we need to be thinking about adaptation as it relates to all of these hazards for our region. So an additional piece of the climate risk and vulnerability assessment is looking at social vulnerability. And so we undertook some mapping exercises which helped us identify where in the region we're seeing social vulnerability. And for those of you who are interested in census data, socioeconomic, and this type of mapping, you might recognize these areas as being kind of our traditional vulnerable areas, whether we're doing an environmental justice assessment. We see a lot of the same patterns in our region, and that's due to the concentrated levels of poverty that we see in our urban areas, specifically Kansas City, Kansas, and Kansas City, Missouri. Here's a list of some of the vulnerability indicators that we included in this social vulnerability index. It includes education, it includes race, income, age, single parent families, whether people are uninsured, health insurance that is, and their employment status. We also took a look at heat vulnerability in the region. This changed up the socioeconomic indicators just a little bit. We included zero vehicle households because that helps us understand people's accessibility to things like cooling centers in the region. Air conditioners or working can be kind of their own little cooling center. We also look at structures built before 1960 kind of as a proxy for structures that may be less energy efficient in the region. Some additional things we've looked at as part of heat vulnerability is kind of in the environmental side. So we think a lot about urban heat island effects, and some of the components included in that are impervious surfacing. So we looked at kind of overlaid impervious surfacing in many of these neighborhoods to see which ones had a lot of impervious, because that is heat absorbing infrastructure. We also looked at tree canopy, and we'll also be doing some more research around neighborhood proximity to cooling centers throughout the region. Adaptive capacity is the final piece of the puzzle here, and it really answers the question, what is our region's ability to adapt and to bounce forward? Do we accept the losses, seek new ways to adapt, or take advantage of new opportunities that may arise? And here's an image, of course, that may look familiar to many of you. This is from July of 2017, and it looks at Indian Creek's flooding near 103rd Street in Warnell. This is the event that basically destroyed Coach's Restaurant that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. So in the adaptive capacity assessment, this was largely a qualitative assessment. We did look at a lot of studies to try to understand the different indicators that are listed here and how much of a challenge or a threat each of these indicators would be to our ability to adapt and to bounce back to any challenges that we'll face related to hazardous events. So I broke these up into kind of different categories to help us potentially see some patterns. This included built environment, economy, environment, government capacity, inequality, and public health. And I'll say that, by no means is this an exhaustive list of indicators, but they were ones that we chose as being ones that are fairly relevant to our region. So we used a kind of a scale, which we're calling the degree of challenge rating, and it goes from high, moderate to low, and then supportive if some of the indicators are actually helping us in our adaptive capacity or we don't know. So here's how it all kind of shook out. So again, anything in red are areas that we've identified as potential challenges to our adaptive capacity. You'll see several of those in the built environment box. Infrastructure condition and maintenance. We have a lot of infrastructure in this region and a lot of it is old. So that will be a huge investment undertaking for us to upgrade and revamp what we have to make sure that it is ready for the climate impacts that we can anticipate in our region. Housing and land use and development, we're a fairly spread out region. That might be kind of an understatement, but the way that we're developed can prevent a challenge, can kind of invite a lot of challenges, especially related to an individual's ability to access jobs, to access education, to access goods and services that they might need. And so we ranked that high. We also included, again, I mentioned we have highly concentrated areas of poverty in our region, and that is related, of course, to the access that is so important in our day-to-day lives. And so we rated that as high and something that we need to continue to tackle and work towards improving through our plan and other planning work. From a government capacity side, budgetary capacity, cities are always feeling a little bit strapped. Sometimes it's, less so when the economy is doing well. But if we have such a large amount of work to do as far as improving our infrastructure and increasing our programming related to low income and poverty, vulnerable populations, we have to spend money to do that, and we need to find additional ways to fund that and help build up that budgetary capacity of our local governments. I included some arrows here which indicate factors or indicators that highly impact our equity outcomes. It's a lot of them. You can make a case that they all impact equity in some way, and all of these indicators relate to each other in some way. This just goes to show that we need to start really thinking systemically about the work that we're doing and move forward with an integrated planning approach. So, but we have a lot of strengths to build on, right? So we are a very caring and giving community. We are always out there to support our community, whether it's neighbors helping neighbors or the philanthropic community kind of stepping up to the plate and providing the means that we need to keep our region resilient. So we have that to work from. We also have really strong regional coordination and leadership in our region. And that speaks to a lot of the great mayors that we have in our local jurisdictions who understand that we do have to work across political boundaries to make things happen for the betterment of everybody. One of our strongest industries is local professional and technical services, which is, where our, engineering and architecture firms kind of live in that space. And we have a very strong innovation ecosystem here in Kansas City. So those two things combined mean that we have the resources right here at home to come up with creative solutions to both mitigation and adaptation and stabilizing our climate. We have a broad social services network. Our nonprofits in the region do a lot of the heavy lifting when it comes to environmental causes. We have a low cost of living here in Kansas City. We've enjoyed that for a very long time and will likely enjoy that for a very long time. We need to maintain that. The Kansas City region also has high environmental quality. There's always room for improvement, but it is one of our strengths that we can continue to build on. So this is our overall kind of findings and opportunities from both the greenhouse gas emissions inventory as well as the CRVA that we'll just reiterate to kind of pull it all together. So our major emission sources are building energy and energy use and transportation. So we will be focusing heavily on those in the climate action plan. As far as mitigation opportunities, renewable energy, continuing to drive up the percentage of renewables that our utilities are drawing from, and building energy efficiency into our buildings and way of living will be really important. increasing mobility options through the region, and ensuring that we're looking at electrification of our fleet and other low carbon fuels, organic waste management system and food systems. There's a lot of opportunity here working with a lot of the organizations that are doing great things in this space to really build that capacity to divert waste from our landfills and help supply food to those who need it. And then sequestration from natural lands. We have a lot of open land here, even within the urbanized area of the region, and there's a lot of opportunities to explore different restoration and protection of those lands to kind of build our capacity for sequestration. On the hazard side, as I mentioned, flooding and heat are largely the hazards that we're most concerned with at this point. Adaptation opportunities include heat island abatement, so expanding our urban forestry, adopting cool roofs, heat wave relief and cooling programs. There's interesting programs in that area that we could explore that are kind of like be a buddy programs, so that we're looking after our neighbors better when it comes to experiencing extreme heat. Green infrastructure, incorporating stormwater best management practices and other types of infrastructure, including transportation infrastructure, climate resilient design standards that can be employed at many different levels, focused land use and development. Mark has a centers and corridors approach where we recommend focused, higher density, mixed use and mixed income development. So our approach overall will be looking at that integrated systems thinking. That'll be really important to make sure that we're leveraging all of the benefits from one area and transition and transfer them to another area. Equitable access. Equity is a key lens that we'll be viewing all of our planning strategies through and implementation as well. And then we also want to pay attention to vulnerable populations and to the extent we can provide data to local governments. So even at the project level, they can take vulnerable populations, their locations and the systems that they rely on into account. So next I'm going to hand this back over to Lindsay Constance and Mike Kelly.
All right. Thank you so much for that information, Doug and Karen. We are going to, we have the slide up here, just making sure that you have access to MindMixer. Tom Jacobs will refer back to this at the end, but this is the online platform where we are hoping that you will log on and give us some of your feedback on some of the different climate solutions and the information from the climate plan. So that is available to you there. We also just wanted to share about a concrete resource that Climate Action KC has created, the Climate Action Playbook. So when we initially began, we had over 100 elected officials that were excited about the Climate Action Plan process, but also wanted access to some concrete and practical things that they could do in their communities right away. So Climate Action KC worked in partnership with Mark and other content area experts and published the Climate Action Playbook last December. This playbook is based upon the international research of Paul Hawken's book, Drawdown, which outlines climate solutions that are already in existence that not only reduce carbon pollution, but save money and provide co-benefits for cities and organizations. We divided our Climate Action Playbook into 6 sectors, including buildings and cities, electricity, food, land use, materials, and transportation. This book has been a really helpful resource for elected officials like myself and Mayor Mike who are looking to take action now. In my city, for example, we've implemented some of the strategies in this playbook in the past few months, including complete streets, green infrastructure, energy efficiency improvements, renewable energy, and looking at how we can provide access to multimodal transportation opportunities. So it's a concrete, great resource for, like I said, cities, but also residents and organizations to use. And I will put the link to access this digitally in the chat as well.
Well, Lindsay, I just beat you to it.
Oh my gosh, we're on the same page.
Sometimes. So really, when we drafted this climate action playbook, we had elected officials in mind, because there was this sentiment that we wanted something to do, and we knew we had to take regional action. But in the meantime, there's still proven solutions that cities and businesses have taken that help with not only the environmental aspects, but also the co-benefits and the bottom line, the triple bottom line that we're all working towards. If you look at the playbook, you'll see that, as Lindsay said, it's divided into those 6 sections in drawdown, but also identifies within those sectors different solutions, like here, distributed renewable energy. There's a really interesting solution through the Direct Renewables program with Evergy as an electric utility, and how cities or large businesses can take advantage of a solution, but also within those actions that can be taken, there are 3 different roles that we identified, whether we lead by example, whether we encourage or incentivize action, or we enact policy. So while this was drafted with elected officials in mind, the solutions in here also work very well for businesses on what they can implement in their own work practices for their employees, for their customers. So you'll see in the, if you can go back just one slide, thank you. We only used proven solutions. So you can see resources and specific examples from cities, Midwestern cities, mind you, that are similar to those in the Kansas City region, where these actions are already in place. So we know the pitfalls and we know the potholes, and hopefully with these kind of resources, we can help swerve around those and implement these solutions in an expeditious fashion. So if you go to the next slide, thank you. We talked a little bit earlier about the role of business and why climate resilience makes sense. Here's a few of the solutions that are within the playbook that you might consider for your business right now to not only mitigate the risk, and Karen did a great job of going into a lot of detail about the risks that we face as a region in terms of our infrastructure or supply chain. But there's also that opportunity for cost savings. Recently, the United Nations has a group called the Business and Sustainable Development Commission. They published a study that showed that companies can unlock 12 trillion with a T in business savings by 2030 by pursuing sustainable low carbon business models. Some of those things include the solution that we've all been experiencing and that we're experiencing right now with telecommuting. There's other things like energy efficiencies in our buildings, or opportunities for renewable energies like wind and solar. We have such an amazing opportunity to take advantage of those given our unique placement in the wind corridor. But there's also great things like native landscape in trees. Not only can that beautify our business community and our campuses, but it also has an impact on our public health. It has an impact on the longevity of the asphalt that's below those trees. So there's a lot of great reasonings to implement these solutions for our businesses that also have the added benefit of helping to work towards a regional goal of reducing emissions, which helps the long-term health and the ability of Kansas City as a region to thrive. You go to the next slide, please. I'd like to introduce next Tom Jacobs, who's the Director of Environmental Programs at MARC. And he's going to talk a little bit more about how we're developing this plan of action. the climate action planning process, we've worked to make sure that it's dynamic, that it's not something that we're just going to put on a shelf, but that's something that we hope can be embraced and utilized by the entire region, local governments, neighborhood associations, but also the important segment of our community, and that's our corporate community. So with that, I'm excited to welcome Tom Jacobs. Tom?
Well, thank you, Mike. I appreciate that. I wanted to just start off and thank everybody. I wanted to thank the Chamber for helping to sponsor this, and especially Adam and Kathy for help working with us to pull this together, and Doug and Karen and Mike and Lindsay. It's just a pleasure. We've got just a tremendous partnership that's building and has been built to try and think broadly about what we can accomplish in our community, become more resilient in the face of different kinds of impacts that await us. And so on this side, we've noted a whole bunch of different kinds of outcomes that we hope to achieve through our regional climate action plan. And we've shared many of these with you already, but so we want to think about the most elegant, creative, impactful, effective strategies that really fire on all cylinders. And so as Karen was walking us through the social vulnerability index and the importance of social equity as a need to address in all of this work, we do hope to identify mitigation and adaptation strategies that focus on social equity as a central lens in our work. But we want to do that in ways that really think about what the green economy might look like, where are there opportunities for innovation and entrepreneurship building on existing strengths in the community, and where possible, think about flexible implementation models that really support a circular economy. So the best example we have of that in town is Ripple collects our beer and wine bottles, and they take it over to in other areas. We have a need absolutely to think about different kinds of funding models to support investment in all. I hope you can hear me. It said my internet connection is unstable. We have a need for new funding models that can support all of the capacity building and investment that's required. On the local government side, we've looked to think about capital improvement programs and existing efforts that could be perhaps modified in certain ways using a climate lens to help achieve clear needs in a community, but also helping to support mitigation and adaptation work. I think that same opportunity exists on the business side, thinking about opportunities for efficiency and renewables and waste management and supply chains and so forth. As Mike said, we're thinking from the individual level, thinking about empowerment and action, from my house right here in Prairie Village to thinking about our neighborhoods, our cities, our watersheds, our region. We're working hard at communication and engagement with everybody, and we really need your help on that. We need to create as big a tent as we possibly can so we can get where we want to go. And ultimately, we hope to develop a performance tracking system that really takes a broad look at triple bottom line benefits and how those align with our greenhouse gas emissions mitigation and adaptation goals. Next slide, please. So where do we go from here? We are on the far left of this slide. We're doing community engagement, although I should say this work that we're undertaking now builds from a long history of work that the Chamber's been involved in and that Mark and many others have been involved in for a long time. We put different name titles on the top. It used to be sustainability, now it's resilience. These things all have a trajectory, and we're trying to knit them together in ways that are ever more impactful. So as Mike described the Mind Mixer site, we strongly encourage you and invite you to give us your smartest ideas on there, and please invite your friends and colleagues and others in your networks to help us with that. We have a project advisory committee that has a diverse mix of stakeholders involved and quite a number of other committees at MARC. I know that we would invite input from any chamber committees to help us think about how this work intersects with other regional efforts. We have convened expert stakeholder groups to help vet the ideas that are proposed on Mind Mixer and refine those using kind of state-of-the-art thinking in each of the areas, from transportation to water to green infrastructure to energy and so on. From there, we're going to put a draft plan together and then bring it back out to the community and wrap it up. And we expect to wrap this whole thing up by December of this year. Next slide, please. So climateactionkc.mindmixer.com. That's where we're steering everybody. And the way we're organizing stuff is in a 6-week process. This week is Transportation Week. Next week is Food and Land Week. And from there, we move on to other topics, the built environment, energy, and industry. And then we have a wrap-up week where we'll try and pull this all together. The amazing thing about Mind Mixer is it's a very dynamic platform. It enables folks to have conversations on any number of different topics, debate what's best and what's most appropriate for our region. We can rank and score. You can share pictures and videos. It's a place where we really want to have an active conversation to figure out what works best for us. And all of this, while we've divided the conversations into these different sectors, we have a variety of different lenses that we would want to apply to the conversations. We've mentioned social equity quite a lot. Public health is obviously another. It's what we're living, and as we think forward about the adaptive capacity of our region to deal with the pandemic, those same issues will likely apply to public health issues that we might confront into the future. We're interested in innovation, environmental health, and all of the sustainability co-benefits that might accrue. And I think now we're on to the very last slide. So from here, what we'd like to do is open this up and have a broad conversation, respond to any questions. I think Adam is going to help moderate that and see what's come in on what's been written in the chat line, and as a group, we'll respond as best we can. So yes, I'm going to wrap up there.
Yeah, we're ready for Q&A now. I had a couple come in, and if you can please utilize the chat feature to ask your questions, that would be greatly appreciated. Thank you. First question coming in: what are we doing as a region to encourage tax breaks, et cetera, to offset economic impacts as a result of enacting policy initiatives to reduce greenhouse gas emissions?
That's a really good question. I think I'll add a little bit to that first. As it comes to the region, I think, first of all, understanding what those economic impacts might be. I don't think there's a clear sense that all of the impacts will be negative. We know there's a lot of cost savings that organizations and businesses can see as they enact different policies to help reduce their emissions. So I think we need some more information about what economic impacts might be. But should there be, significant impacts, I think, tax breaks or other incentives and mechanisms that can help offset those impacts is something, that could definitely be looked into to help make sure that everybody who has a role in reducing greenhouse gas emissions can adequately take on that role and be a part of the solution.
One thing I might weigh in on this question, from a city's perspective, we use what's called an FCIP, a Facility Conservation Improvement Plan, and it allowed us to structure the different sustainability measures we wanted to do in a way that the savings from one helped pay for later investments that might be more costly. So overall, we were able to save money. So structuring it that way for our city was really helpful. And then at the end, we saw an overall economic benefit.
And there's differences between jurisdictions. Obviously, Kansas and Missouri have different opportunities, whether through energy efficiency investment acts in Missouri. There was a proposed bill in Kansas, and I'm not sure what's going on in Kansas today with their sin dying session. but we're curious to see whether that will be taken up. Whether there's opportunities for rebates for energy efficiency programs. Sometimes it's jurisdiction to jurisdiction. And additionally, there's some solutions within the playbook that you can see that there's actions that municipalities can take, regardless of size, to incentivize some of the actions. For one example, composting. I think there's a comment coming about food waste. There are cities right now that are incentivizing or offsetting the cost of compost barrels, providing instructions for how that can be done, and then offsetting a portion of the cost to allow individuals to compost. So whether it's larger scale from energy or a smaller scale for food waste, there's opportunities that jurisdictions have taken advantage of to help ease some of the offset costs. But again, like has been said, if you look at the long-term fiscal impact for a lot of these solutions, it comes out positive regardless of incentivization.
All right, thank you guys. As we said before, if you have any questions, please utilize the chat feature. You can post it in the everyone, or you can send it directly to me, Adam Timmerman. Next one we had here, this is Goodwill. I'm going to say their name because they put it out there. They divert approximately 7 million pounds from landfills through their operations. Each donated good retail store opened diverts approximately 1.2 million pounds of landfill waste. They are looking to grow their footprint throughout the region. Are there resources available for their sustainability efforts that they may be able to leverage to cover costs in opening more nonprofit stores? And if so, is there a site that they could go to research into those resources?
Let me take the first crack at an answer to that one. This is Tom. Mid-America Regional Council administers something called the MARC Solid Waste Management District. The district offers grants to public, private, and nonprofit organizations that further the district's mission of waste diversion from area landfills. We award somewhere in the neighborhood of $500,000 a year in grant funds. And if there was a need to help support the development of your infrastructure for waste diversion and all of the other good goals that Goodwill strives to meet, it might be a nice candidate. You can feel free to reach out to me. There's quite a bit of information on the MARC website. Google MARC Solid Waste Management District, and you should see quite a lot of information on a grant program there.
All right, thank you for that. I got another one in. In putting together these guidelines, have you reached out to key industries which may be impacted, such as food production? There may be action already being taken to improve climate resilience in those industries.
I think the answer is yes, and there's definitely a recognition that there's good things going on. There's a lot of Kansas City businesses that are leaders in terms of implementing some of these solutions for their own sake. I know we have a really robust design community in Kansas City. We have general contractors, engineers, and architects that are designing the living and working spaces for places all across the world. And they have taken the lead in implementing a lot of these solutions for their impacts on the environment, but also in their own right, based on their cost efficiency and the economic impact to the company. So we are absolutely wanting to heed that knowledge and help amplify some of those solutions that are already taking place in the Kansas City metropolitan area. And you mentioned the food sector. There's some amazing things going on here. This entire plan is built on a foundation of resilience that's been laid for decades within our region, and a recognition that there are good solutions that given energy, given scale, can help Kansas City thrive into the next century.
And then we had a comment, not a question, but this person said for financial assistance, you can look at programs being offered in Missouri through Evergy Expire to help rebate costs as well. But I did just get another question, and what climate impacts have we seen in the KC region as a result of stay-at-home orders?
I'm not in a position to speak necessarily to economic impact. I know that there's a group that's looking in detail on that. One thing that I'm keenly aware of is that transportation was reduced by about 50%, which is a striking impact that would relate to broader economic impacts. Do others of you have more detailed information to respond?
I think at this point, the jury's still out on the economic impact of COVID-19 and how that's going to affect our region generally. I think it, again, the jurisdiction to jurisdiction is having different impacts based on the makeup of the commercial sector within those communities, whether they're heavy industrial or they're heavy service sector, or they're more of a bedroom community, so to speak. So I don't think there's necessarily a one size fits all, but I think from a long-term perspective, we're yet to see what will be the economic impacts for our region due to COVID-19. But in the meantime, we can take some of these lessons and we can apply them moving forward to try to mitigate the impacts to the next challenges. Karen talked about the risks that we face. In the last year, there were 8 different natural disasters that caused over $1 billion worth of damage in the United States. And the more prepared that we are to take on some of these challenges, the quicker we're going to be able to react as an economy for the region. And the sooner we're going to be able to continue to thrive from a business standpoint. So that's one lesson that we can take, is that preparedness has its place. And that's one of the things we hope to help accomplish through this planning process.
And then in follow-up to that, has there been noticeable climate impacts because of stay-at-home order? Have we seen cleaner air quality, cleaner water because of less people traveling? Is that something that has been measurable or not?
From a climate perspective, I mean, climate is long-term, right? It's a long-term measure. And so we won't see any immediate impacts from something that we're currently living in. Related to air quality, we've looked at air quality from about, I want to say March 1st to now, and then compared that same time frame to the last several years to see if we've seen any impacts. We have, because spring weather generally is it's wetter. We don't have a ton of hot days. We don't see a lot of variability between the years and what we're experiencing now. But we can assume that there has been, some positive air quality benefits. And anecdotally, a lot of people have reported that just from a visibility standpoint, people can see much further in the region from high points. But from a transportation perspective, as Tom mentioned, we've seen kind of a sustained decrease in traffic volumes throughout the region. And so you can extrapolate from that there's a associated decrease in ozone precursor emissions. So it'll be, we're seeing a bit of a drop in our ozone readings throughout the region for the month of May. We've gotten past some other, air quality events that happen in our region, which is the Flint Hills burning. So we'll be able to see more clearly now what those impacts are in the month of May.
Thank you. And then Got another question in here. Do you all foresee any changes in how the city of Kansas City, Missouri changes economic incentives, such as requirements for tougher energy efficiency standards as a prerequisite for TIF or tax abatement support in commercial or industrial RE development? The same question could apply to any municipality's development policy, but KCMO is the focus question, focus city of this question.
I know Jerry's listening, and he already typed a comment, so I don't know if he has some insider information he can type into the chat, but I know there's a lot of pressure around requirements related to TIF and tax abatement support. So whether, I don't know, it's hard to say that we foresee any particular changes around that, but it is something that that has been done in other areas of the country, and so it's not impossible. Maybe Jerry has some thoughts on that he can type in.
I would say anecdotally on this one, I have noticed a shift in that when developers come forward with a project, they do often lead with those sustainability measures, and perhaps a few years ago that might not have been the case. So I think it has to do with the fact that cities are leading by example, and that's what our playbook is all about. That first step is let's lead by example, and I've seen some difference just in my neck of the metro.
One of the things that passed in the city of St. Louis and now in Roland Park, Kansas, is a solar ready ordinance for new construction. And what that does is requires an electrical and a rooftop plan for solar on new construction. Not to say that solar has to be installed, but that the architect and the electrician, when designing a new building, has that plan in place for the potential addition of solar. We looked at the economic impact of that. It actually helps to save either a residence or a commercial business thousands of dollars by having that planning process be done in the construction phase, as opposed to having that planning be done apart from the initial construction. For a residence, it saves about $4,000, and on a commercial property, it saves approximately $25,000. So anecdotally, like Lindsay said, these considerations are going to continue to come up. But it's not always going to be at a potential loss or a requirement for an incentive from the municipality.
And we just got a comment and follow up to that in the chat. It says KCMO is looking at more advanced energy codes as well as tax incentive requirements. Also, of some interest is building performance standards, residential and commercial, etc. Overall, no explicit age. And then last call for questions. If anyone has any more in the chat feature, you can enter them there. If not, I would turn it over back to our panel. If you guys have any last parting words before we wrap up, that we can do that now.
No, Adam, just to say thank you very much to the Chamber for continuing to be a great convener of voices for the Kansas City region. We really hope that that voice comes and participates in this planning process over at climateactionkc.mindmixer.com. Each of the next 6 weeks, we have a different topic that we're going to talk about, this week being Transportation Week. And having dynamic participation from the business community is so important there, because the things that are important to the business community are really important to the long-term opportunity for Kansas City as a region to be resilient and to thrive. So we really hope you will join us there with your thoughts, your comments, and your vision for a resilient, thriving Kansas City.
Well, thank you, everyone. I'll be following up with everyone that registered. I'll send out a recording of the event along with the links that were included in the chat feature to the Mind Mixer. If anyone has anything else, feel free to reach out. I apologize if you hear mowing. They're mowing right outside my window. But I hope you all have a fantastic Memorial Day weekend. And thank you for joining us. Thank you to our panel for sharing all their information today. It was a fantastic presentation. A good way to go into the holiday weekend. If you have. Thank you again, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
We
you,
appreciate
Adam.
it.
Thank you. Bye.